just listing your professional credentials for people out there to hear where you're at.
Sure. So I'm a clinical and an organizational psychologist. And for the purposes of this talk, I guess I would add that my doctoral studies were in positive psychology. A little bit before that was even a thing. So we'll get a chance to talk more about that a little bit later.
Yeah, I would love to dive into the positive psychology realm. That's something that fascinates me. But I want to start with mental health because I do think that I guess it's always been important, but it's more important more now than ever, right? So I was wondering if you could just break down what mental health is to begin with.
Okay, well, and this might circle us back quickly to the positive psychology.
Okay, perfect.
So, interestingly, when people are talking about mental health, they're usually talking about mental illness. They're usually talking about mental health problems. So when people talk about mental health, they're usually talking about the major clinical disorders like anxiety or depression or OCD or psychotic disorders. And so they're talking about the presence or absence of those kinds of illnesses in the general population. And so that was some of the early roots of the research that we completed in positive psychology, was that in particularly for clinicians in the clinical research that was done, by far most of the work done in the early I would say 30, 40, 50 years of clinical psychology was on clinical illnesses and not on mental health. So when people talk about mental health, it's really about illness they're talking about, and mental health, emotional fitness and well-being, even thriving, is in many ways a whole other realm of research and practices.
Okay, so can you help distinguish the difference? I mean, I understand that there's a difference in terms of clinical mental illness and mental health, which is well-being. Um, how else do they, I guess, yeah, how else do they differ, and
How
what's
you
the...
separate those things? Sure. So maybe one key takeaway in all of this is that I think about it as on a continuum, roughly. And a lot of the work that we're doing in clinical work, and a lot of what people are focused on, is trying to keep the symptoms down. So trying to keep those things that get in people's way or make people feel emotionally or mentally unwell, to keep those at bay. And so they're working, if you think about a scale of 1 to 10, with 0 being feeling really terrible and 10 feeling really great, they're working between 0 and 5. So they're trying to restore or maintain functioning with as few symptoms as possible. And that puts people in the realm of what we're working on in clinical work, which is, how we deal with emotions, how we basically respond to emotions, what kinds of ideas or thoughts we have that might be getting in the way, that we can deconstruct and reframe in a more constructive way, how we help the body who might be experiencing or trying to absorb or metabolize different emotions that we're faced by. And that's kind of at the front end of that scale. When we're talking about managing mental health, we're often in that part of the range. Now, what's interesting is what puts you in the mental health, if we think about it, more emotional well-being, what we classically, and I'm doing big air quotes, think about as happiness. Other factors drive people into the 6 to 10 range than just the absence of symptoms. And that's a critical thing to be thinking about when you're functioning and you want to get into the great range. It's not just keeping things at bay, it's how you invite and cultivate practices that put you in that good end of the range, in terms of the mindsets that you adopt, the way that you interact with your own emotions, levels of self-awareness and self-management that can really take you up closer to the top of that range. And that's where I think about emotional well-being. I like to think about emotional fitness and thriving. So a useful metaphor for me when I think about physical health is that people often are thinking about, again, like the absence of symptoms, that I'm not sick. That
Mhm.
means I'm healthy. When I think about health, I think about what would a physiotherapist, for example, think about, or a trainer. They're thinking about a whole bunch of different realms that make somebody fit. What's your cardio like? What's your agility like? What's your speed like? What's your strength like? And you can think about emotional health as having some of those realms. You know, how aware are people? What's their vocabulary like for emotions? What kind of emotion control do they have? How aware are they of their thoughts? How actively do they use their mindset for optimal thinking? How much do they leverage their body? Do they understand the relationship between their body and their emotional well-being? So I think about these different factors that promote emotional and mental fitness. And right now, when we think about COVID, you're saying, you know, mental health might be more important than ever. We're certainly more aware of the impact of all of the change and strains and, let's call it, losses and turbulence that we're feeling. And that emotional fitness is what helps us to absorb or buffer what's coming at us in terms of challenges and difficulties and get back on our feet, just like physical fitness, as quickly as possible and restore our good functioning and even get us into a good place despite the difficulties going on around us, to kind of pivot and put ourselves back in good conditions for high functioning, for performance, for well-being. And that's when you really want to call upon that fitness. And what's challenging for people right now is that if you hadn't already built it, you're feeling it maybe even that much more, because in the general population, people are not terribly aware of what contributes to their mental emotional fitness and working it actively so that it's available to them when hard times hit.
Yeah, I really like that scale of like the feeling 0 to 5 and then feeling 6 to 10, because there's a difference that I think everybody feels, right? Everybody's been in that 0 to 5, and then everybody's also been in that 6 to 10, and they want to stay in that 6 to 10. And I mean, it's not as easy as just deciding to be into the 6 and 10. And when you describe it as exercise, I I love that, because it's something that you have to constantly work on. So what are some exercises, I guess, if you are in that 0 to 5, to bring yourself into the 6 and 10, or 6 to 10?
Mm, that's a good question. And I like to think about it in those two parts. So it would depend on when I met you.
Mm-hmm.
So if I met you and you were feeling two,
Yeah.
I'd focus on helping you to address those things that have got you in that range. So what's going on? What's outside of your awareness? What are you absorbing that has you feeling in that range? So it might be corrective measures. So for example, or when people feel in that like a two, they're struggling day to day. And that could be understanding, being able to name and understand the emotions they're experiencing, knowing how to respond to those emotions when they arise. A lot of the time it has to do with the cognitions, it has to do with thought patterns, whether those are depressive thought patterns or anxious thought patterns or angry thought patterns. What's feeding those emotions back into the loop that could be sustaining somebody, keeping them at that low end, that we need to bring into conscious awareness and know how to respond to and take corrective measures to get them back to functioning, where they're not being derailed all the time by their thoughts and their emotions. And then as people approach that range, then we start to work on, okay, now that you have some of the basic mechanics of things that contribute or derail your emotional functioning, how do you leverage some of that understanding? And then we add some more things in to get you up into that high range and start to build additional resilience as well. So that even if derailing things happen, because even if you're functioning really well, people experience these kind of collisions in life of a bunch of things happening to them at once that you land sometimes keeled over in the ditch, kind of giving yourself a shake, like what just happened? But when you have all of this knowledge, awareness, and conditioning, you can much more quickly right yourself and get back on track. And as those conditions settle, and as you actively settle them, you get back into that high end of functioning much more quickly and actively, because you have the condition, you have the knowledge, you know what the levers are.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing that I'm continually discovering as I dive more into mindset and is that I do realize that mindset is a tool and or a set of tools that you can be aware of and you can learn. I mean, I listen to so many podcasts and I listen to all these things that sound like I can apply them in my life, but it's almost like you have to wait to experience something in order to apply it to your life, and then you can use that tool to, I guess, like you said, bring yourself up from that lower score to a higher score and feel a little bit better about yourself. So I really resonate with that, and I find that very fascinating. I wonder if, like, especially during COVID, right? Like, do you think that maybe not some people, but do you think it's possible that people almost use it as an excuse to feel low, because something so catastrophic and huge in the world has happened, that it affects them in a way where they think that everything is negative and it kind of skews their lens a little bit?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that speaks directly to the mindset that you're talking about. So that we have these internalized mindsets that we may or may not be aware of. So, it would be easy to justify feeling discouraged, feeling out of control, feeling that things are pretty bleak, because there's lots of bleak things going on and there are lots of things we're out of control of. However, and I think you had once talked about self-determination theory, and there's certain models of what motivates humans. Well, feeling in control of their life is one of those motivating things, and feeling out of control of one's life really crushes motivation. It's that sense of autonomy and competence and connection that gets activated. So in this context, control is a really big one. And this is kind of a real sore spot for most people right now, is what we do and don't have control over. And so for some, a sense of internalized control, a high sense of self-efficacy, a feeling that I control the outcomes of my life, folks who have that mindset tend to do better. They're going to see what parts of control they do have, and they are going to exercise control over those things that they do have control of. And they're going to make thoughtful choices that help them feeling the most in control they can feel, which brings down the stress levels and creates opportunities. Example, in this context, there's a lot of businesses that can't do things that they had planned to do. There's a lot of individuals and professionals who also had plans professionally, what they wanted to accomplish, that are not accessible right now. Same with individuals and families. And what you see is, how do people pivot? So at first, people are just emotionally absorbing the hit of, this is not what I expected. This is not what I wanted. I'm disappointed. I'm frustrated, all that. And you can absorb that. You don't deny that. You acknowledge that. And then shortly thereafter say, well, what am I going to do then? And this is where the mind is starting to pivot. How do I regain a sense of control? So a lot of businesses and professionals are saying, what does one invest in this kind of economy? So you'll see some people doubling down on product development. So they still believe in the product, is eventually the market's going to come back and that product is going to work, but they're shifting their investments in terms of what they'll invest in when, and what they're going to emphasize and de-emphasize. They're using the levers that they have to position themselves best now and investing for the future. And this is a way to constructively use a downtime. Individuals are doing the same thing. You see people who are hoping to change jobs and leap levels professionally, who are unsure of making a change in this market. they're taking recertifications, they're taking online courses, they're taking on responsibilities to build out their CV so that the market comes back, they're not on pause. They're continuing to invest so that they're ready for when the market comes back to get back on track and recover that time to the best of their ability. That's that internalized mindset of I control, in air quotes, my own outcomes. So efforts that I make translate to outputs. Whereas if you, in contrast, there are those who have an external locus of control, where they feel like life happens to you, and you were describing that earlier. It's a lousy market. I don't really have any choices or control. So you kind of have that feeling when you even think about those different words and phrases, you don't have any motivation to invest effort and time and money in things because you feel it's not going to produce output, so you don't. And so you see like how that shift changes your actions and changes the outcomes. And folks who are constantly working from that mindset, consciously or not, have different results under difficult, even very trying circumstances, not just like pretty much all the circumstances, but even during trying circumstances.
Yeah, and that internal versus external locus of control, that feeling whether you are in control of your life or life just happens to you, is that something that's innate, or is that something that you can build within yourself?
That's one of my favorite questions. And if you were to guess, what's the percent of whether or not, or that's biological, innate, or cultivated, would you guesstimate?
What would I guess? Oh,
Yeah,
in
just
terms
for
of
fun.
let's see here. I would guess, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is I think that it would be 50-50 in terms of, I think that there are certain things that you um, can learn and switch, and then there's certain things that are innate as well in terms of just brain chemicals and that sort of thing. So I would guess 50-50.
That's a great guess. It's about, a lot of these variables come out about 50-50.
Really?
And even something like happiness and inherent positivity, optimism, a lot of these things come out about 50-50. And then you can see it as a reflection of the mindset, because then some people respond, will say, well, I'm kind of screwed. 50% has already gone right out the window. And the other half will say, I still have 50% within my reach
Mm-hmm.
because I have 50% control. So does biology make a difference? Sure. But the interesting thing is most of these things have been shown to be something you can cultivate, something you can learn. And so even if you didn't come by it naturally, when you build it in, or when you do exercise, this is conditioning, it's training, you can more and more build the skills associated. And that mindset, and growth mindset is a great example. They discover these phenomena by watching people for whom it happens naturally. They discover it naturalistically, and then they go, well, this is interesting, look at how these people respond to the same conditions that somebody else is responding to completely differently, and it's much more adaptive for them. Can we train that? And
Mm-hmm.
so things like growth mindset and motivations that some people come by naturally, you can teach others
Mm-hmm.
to learn how to think that way, and eventually becomes integrated, and they're not thinking about it anymore. It's how they think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I just look at myself, and I think that it was cultivated for me like this opportunity seeking thing, where I used to almost just be this pessimist that just, I think I think I had an external locus of control. And it wasn't until I started reading books and listening to podcasts that I realized that it wasn't something that was 100% biological, and that I could change it. And then I started implementing practices that I heard on other podcasts that would help me, and they did. So it's weird because I totally understand that someone can look at mental health practices like meditation and all, I don't know, something as simple as cold showers, even, that people can look at and be like, oh, I would never do that. I don't think that would work. Yeah. Why would you ever do that? Because I've been that person before, and fast forward 3 or 4 years after reading and kind of understanding this stuff and diving into the psychology research, I believe it now. And it's so interesting. And that kind of leads me to what we talked about earlier in depressive realism, right?
Mhm.
Where there's the opportunist and then there's the pessimist almost. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, and I'm going to make one more point about what you just said about the practices. If there's what there, that's the one thing, the one key to take away around making that shift is it's about practices. You actually need to do something differently repeatedly, and then eventually it goes from, I think everybody's, or many people have heard this, it goes from you feel unconsciously incompetent to consciously incompetent to,
Hmm.
you move through these, where it's you're very aware of not thinking the way that you're trying to think and finding it very arduous or laborious. And then over time, as you repeat this mental habit that you're trying to cultivate, it becomes much smoother and smoother until finally it's fully integrated, and you can seem to remember that you used to think differently, but sometimes it gets to a point where you barely remember that you used to think another way, because it becomes smoother. But that only happens through experimentation and conditioning. And so those people who are open to trying it, even if they're skeptical, a lot of motivation shows up later in the conditioning process. So people seek often to have the motivation to make changes up front, where what's motivating is often what's rewarding. And so at the front end, we don't reap those rewards as much. So we almost have to take these leaps of faith to try things out. And then we see what happens and we observe how we feel or what was the outcome. And then we go, hey, that was pretty good. Let me try that again. And motivation kind of joins in partway through the stream, almost as a reinforcer to continue the practice. And then over time, it becomes its own reward because you continually see the positive benefits. So that whole notion of being an active experimenter and actively working on mental health, that not assuming that it's the default, realizing it's all about training. And if I stop training and stop using these practices, it will stop working, just like physical fitness is really a key. And the depressive realism, to answer your question, was what tripped off my studies, my doctoral studies. And at the time, there was this really great debate going on, which was really fun because for many, many, many years, like there was a lot of what we classically think about as the Freudian thinkers. So the psychodynamic thinkers who inherently, if they talked about mental health, it's like the absence of defense mechanisms. Which you probably learned about somewhere along the way in school around how the ego defends itself in these various and sundry ways. And for them, if you're behaving in a defensive way, then there's a weakness of the ego, there's a weakness of that person. And then in comes this research from a completely different field, and more in the cognition field, saying that, hold on a minute, there are these folks out there who have these biases and they actually seem to be doing a little better than those who are realistic or undefended in their perceptions. So the depressive realism notion is that people who see things very realistically actually have more of the symptoms of depression, whereas those who see things through rose-colored glasses have protective benefits and have better outcomes, which threw sent the Freudians into an uproar, because it flew in the face of all of the thinking of undefended people are those who are psychologically well. And this whole other school of thought was saying, wait a minute, let's take a closer look at this. It actually looks like somewhat optimistic people have this protective buffer that enables better outcomes for them. And so that was the early roots of positive psychology, and looking at people who are emotionally and mentally well. what do they look like? How do they behave? How do they think? And studying them in more detail to see, is it realistic? Is it a little bit positive? Is it a lot positive? Where does it break down? What's the upside? What's the downside? So that started about 20 years ago, of studying, doing more in-depth studies around those who are psychologically buffered. What are their practices and habits?
Wow. So there's a distortion that can be a benefit then? Like, I'm trying to imagine a situation where, let's say you are on a hike and you reach this peak, and you expect it to be beautiful up there, and you get up there and it's cloudy and dark. Um, One could argue like it's not beautiful, you know? Let's be real. It sucks up here. We just wasted our time. Versus you could just choose to see the beauty in the rose colored glasses that you talk about, and you're saying that that distortion of seeing the beauty in that moment can actually be a long-term benefit to our mental health.
Okay, well, you have a lot packed into your
Yeah,
scenario.
totally. Yeah, agreed.
Well, fair. Let's borrow that situation. It's a good one. Um, because what seems least credible is when somebody looks at a cloudy sky and says, "Oh, so beautiful," because everything's okay. This one's, smoking something good when you say something like that, right? They
Yeah.
lose credibility. They lose face almost immediately. But that particular situation, I would say, is probably one much more where you're going to see the emotional fitness of somebody who's psychologically well, because they weren't hoping for the cloudy sky either.
Hmm.
So the one who's doing well, who's emotionally fit, it's not lost on them that it's rainy and cloudy, and that's not the ideal thing to see after a long day's hike. They would love the clear view and the blue skies and all of that as well.
Hmm.
But they're more likely to pivot quickly to notice what is good about this. What can I connect with here? So they might acknowledge, it's like, okay, this is a bummer. This is not what we had banked on. But you'll notice that they'll pivot quickly to, well, I feel really great to have made it to the top. And I really enjoyed when I left this morning, it was all about the peak this morning. It's all I could think about was the view I would see. But I realized all day how much I've been enjoying the climbing and the striving and the figuring it out and feeling tired and getting over it and continuing and kind of focusing on the path and the forest on the way and the conversation if you hiked with somebody else and getting to know them, and even getting up at the top, there's a certain peacefulness about being in a cloudy, rainy environment that you can connect with. And so you'll hear them connecting with what feels real. So it's not masked, it's not painted over, but they will be able to connect with what does feel good to them about that moment without needing to deny what isn't there that they wished for. And excuse me, I think that's a critical difference, is that people who are psychologically sound, fit, emotionally well, they're not necessarily denying, and they're mostly not denying. They can hold two things at once. They can hold that disappointment and the gray skies while also noticing connection, beauty, accomplishment, kind of what's the word, mindfulness of the experience right alongside of it, and they can invite it all in. One doesn't cancel out
Hmm.
the other.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I I think I'm in real time learning from that in terms of the way I used to be versus the way I am now. And it's like, it's almost this like ongoing battle where I'll notice myself, let's say in the middle of the hike, focusing on the pain and focusing on the negative attributes of it. And I'm not having fun in those moments. And then I'll remember, oh, okay, this is actually in your control. You can choose to focus on what is positive, right? And as soon as I realize that I'm in that, like, I don't know, previous Jeremy, like version 1.0
Mhm.
versus version 2.0 of myself, it it totally changes, and I enjoy the experience that much more.
Well, and that's, I mean, wow, my thoughts go so quickly to mindfulness and mindful training, because you need to catch that corner of saying, I'm being my former Jeremy.
Mm,
You know, to catch that moment of, I'm at this fork in the road and I can continue down this path of pain and suffering and complaint, or I can go, yeah, I'm tired and my legs are sore, and acknowledge it. Because, by the way, emotion acknowledgement is a huge healthy part of emotional fitness, of just, you know, naming it and acknowledging it and then moving on, and then saying, okay, what can I or do I want to take from this? And what's interesting is, you know, you said, um, you know, you had made this shift, and sometimes that shift comes from modeling from somebody else. So if you're going up this mountain with somebody and somebody's, you know, you're feeling like, oh, can we just stop? This is brutal. And I'll bet you we're not even gonna be able to see because it's been cold and rainy all day. And the other person's saying, you know what? I'm just enjoying the hike. You know, no matter what's up there, you know, we set this day aside to do this. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. I really just want to push on. It'll be what it'll be up there. You never know. By the time we get up there, maybe the clouds will part and we'll see. But either way, I just like to push on a little bit more. And you just never. And you can hear this alternate way, this alternate view of the world. You're like, oh, that's really, if you're open to it, that's really interesting. And you might join them in their mindset and see how it works for you to like try it on. And you'll notice when you might be open to being influenced that way, that then on your own, you might think about, if Jeremy was my model in that case, I might think, in another difficult situation, how would Jeremy see this? What would he say to me right now when I'm in front of this difficult situation? I'll bet you he'd say something like this. We don't know what he'd really say, but we're trying on the mindset by kind of calling to our inner Jeremy, like that inner mental model, to see if we can find words, find perspective, find a frame of reference that's going to help us through a difficult spot, because it's a new skill set. And to kind of conjure up positive models helps us to try and figure out, what would that look like? What would that feel? Let me try this and see how that goes. Others learned it from reading books or watching videos or whatever the case, but it gives us this alternative to try once we've been exposed to it in some form or other.
yeah, I agree. And I've found through my journey that you're right. The most important thing is noticing when you do have that decision to make, and like you choose which version of yourself you want to be, you know? I notice myself kind of something as simple as like, okay, well, version 2.0, Jeremy, you're going to brush your teeth every single night rather than go to bed before you brush your teeth, you know, because you're tired and you're lazy and you don't want to do it, right? But in those moments when I catch myself wanting to slip back to Jeremy 1.0, I ask myself, what decision will make you love yourself more in the future, you know? And when I ask myself that, then the decision becomes clear that I want to be the person that brushes my teeth every night versus the person who doesn't, you know? Um,
Well, and it's so great because you're owning it either way. And
mhm,
so I think the healthy folks, there's a level of consciousness and a level of conscious choice that's going on a lot of the time. You know, we can say all of the time, but a good deal of the time they're seeing the fork and they're seeing their choice and they're owning their choices. So, you know, like if you slip back into an old habit, you own it. I decided to forego the thing that I've been working at today, and I'll figure out tomorrow and get back on track, or I won't. But this is not the circumstance. This is not anybody else's fault. This is me choosing not to do. It is what it is. Or, and it's another kind of psychological strategy that's a good one. You know, you borrowed from your future self. You had a conversation with your future self, and it's a technique that's really useful. So when we think about COVID, or when we think about those moments where we don't feel like something, and we think about, what would my future self think about this if I were to fast forward 3 months or 6 months or 10 years? How would my future self look at the choice I'm making right now, and how comfortable am I making it nonetheless?
Mhm.
Because it kind of projects us into our future, and we kind of work back from there to be that person I want to be. What do I need to do now? And sometimes we can find a little extra boost or motivation to stay aligned with ourselves. What's interesting is we've made an external self into the future, but it's kind of an internal motivation because it's still us. We're aligning with ourselves. It's just a future self that we're trying to conjure up to kind of find some extra motivation in the moment that we feel is lagging, or a little bit, lacking in the moment. And we figure, maybe my future self can lend a hand here.
Yeah, it's interesting because it actually comes down to you almost tap into this energy source and you have more energy because you are appreciative that you made a conscious choice, that it's the right choice almost, like on that hike, when I make that choice to think more positively, I have more energy to get to the top, you know?
Mhm.
Find that
Well,
fascinating.
I love that part because I think of it as your higher self.
Okay.
And the parallel for me is and this is where I think the mindful meditation practice is so useful, because when we're in the pain and the suffering and the discomfort, we're often in lower brain, where all the kind of the base emotions and sensations are in our lower brain. And if we fuse with them, we're kind of really being one with the pain and the suffering. And it's difficult to kind of rise out of that and make more thoughtful, mindful choices and decisions. But when we engage in a meditation practice, we learn that skill to acknowledge the sensations and the emotions, and we gradually can shift up into higher brain and observe ourselves. That's how we know. I call it the balcony, so as opposed to the mosh pit, because there's all kinds of instinctive pain and suffering and joy, all kinds of stuff, like real base things happening there.
Cool.
And sometimes you get this skill to kind of take the steps up to the balcony and look down onto yourself and make some thoughtful choices. Do you want to stay down there? Are you having fun? Is it worth it to you? Or do
Mhm.
you want to come up here and just get a little bit of healthy detachment to see yourself go and decide whether or not you want to continue or make a new choice? And when you think about that future self, it's a balcony view. We have to be able to put down the immediate sensation and emotion and go up into the cerebral cortex, up in that balcony, and look at ourselves from a different angle, and without judgment, with just openness, curiosity, and vision, to say, I'm at a choice point here. Which way do I want to take it? And own it either way. If you decide go back in the mosh pit, knock yourself out. But
Mhm.
say, I made the choice. It seemed worth it to me. It's all good. And we've all made those choices and been happy with them too sometimes.
Mhm.
And then there are other times it's like, no, I really want to align in a different way. And though this is fun, or though this feels easier, I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to take another path.
Wow. So let's say today's world, COVID is affecting somebody and they're in that 0 to 5 range in terms of well-being, right? Would you say that that's one of like the foundational steps they can do, is like realize that they may be in that mosh pit that you talk about and try and go to the balcony and look at the way they're feeling and try and look at what they're doing in a different light?
Well, I'm glad you bring that example, because I think that would be too much to ask. I
Yeah.
mean, I think some folks who are suffering a lot right now have those skills and abilities and may be able to access them. But if they didn't already have them, I think it would be, I mean, I don't know if too much, but it would be an awful lot to ask somebody who is in, because of the COVID circumstances, which could be health, it could be financial, it could be family, it could
Mhm.
be all of them. If there's one thing I'm seeing from my clinical practice, is that people are being hit from multiple angles all at once, which is really, really taxing the resources they have to cope.
Mm.
So if they were at that low end and they didn't already have those skills, what I would say is more about how do they tend to those emotions, and how do they calm the body and calm the nervous system and create some restorative space, so that, because the body's in a lot of absorption and reaction because it's suffering so intensely. And when you can calm that down, that's when you can start to elevate into thinking about, okay, now what can I do next that's going to get me? And I like to think about people moving, inching their way along that continuum. So not too many people, some, but very few people make leaps up the scale. They tend to kind of push themselves up. So if you're at 2, what does 3 and 4 look like? Or if you're at 4, how do you inch your way towards 6? And to kind of get some guidance around, how can I move up that scale? So one thing I noticed is that, we do some pro bono work for frontline medical professionals. And in the early days, we were wondering, hey, are they aware of what we're offering? Because sometimes they weren't taking them up, but they were so exhausted and depleted, some of them couldn't even take the time to consult. So it gives you a sense of how much they're kind of stuck in that pit. It's like, okay, what do we need to do? What can we put in place to free them up enough to catch their breath and to be able to get a little bit of restorative sleep and food and breaks and those kinds of things, so that then we can take them a little bit further up the scale and start to invest in them in a different way. But if they're really down in that pit, sometimes it's very difficult until we can kind of help them out of there to be able to do some of the work that's really going to take them into that kind of balcony level thinking, because they're in a basic, almost survival mode at times.
Yeah, so basically calming down that fight or flight response that we kind of naturally have. What are some techniques to calm that down then? Like, I mean, you can imagine meditation, but are there some other quicker versions to someone who may not really get meditation yet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, this is a great time if you can to learn it. Like, I think about some of my best practices that I use in my daily life are ones that I learned during sometimes difficult pause periods like this one. But I think it's not the easiest time for a lot of people to learn this sort of thing. They're, like you say, in survival mode. And I think about basic restorative. Like, I would work on sleep. I would regulate sleep patterns. I mean, I think we can all relate to what happens to us when we're not getting enough sleep. You can do all kinds of fancy things if you're getting very little sleep. Your resources are so low, because a big chunk of coping is mental. And if your sleep is low, it's very hard to engage those resources. So exercise, because exercise has a huge regulatory effect for emotions. Like, there's a big chemistry involved there and I would say the simplest of exercises, like short walks and breaks and things like that, to allow the body to recover, because the body is such a useful aid in coping.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I'd say is nature. There's a huge appeasing effect on the body to be in nature. So if you can take a walk and do it in a forest, it helps to calm the nervous system, like basic breathing. So I'd go right back to fundamentals to calm the body down and calm the nervous system down, because you're replenishing some of the resources that you need then to cope and problem solve and plan and figure out how to connect with people, which are a little bit higher up on the scale than when you're in survival mode and you can't reach out to take the resources that might even be available to you.
Interesting. And I'm putting myself in those shoes where you're in that fight or flight mode. I mean, sometimes the last thing you want to do is exercise, right? Because your energies feel low, and the last thing you want to do is go on a walk and go to nature. So let's say that's the case, going back even a step further and even understanding that it may help you. What can you do in that moment to kind of convince yourself that it's going to help to go exercise?
Well, you don't generally need to convince yourself, though people frequently say that. Everybody
Okay.
knows.
Yeah.
So, and if you ask them, they know too, and they will confirm, but they'll say, often the phrase is, I can't find the motivation. And I'll say, never mind motivation, you're just in do mode. Don't look for motivation. Don't try to convince yourself any of it. You know all of those things. So the habit formation literature is really well developed, and there's a lot of really useful tips and literature out there and good books. One of them James Clear is one of the writers. He writes Atomic Habits, and there's another one called, I'm trying to think of a Duhigg's book on how habits are built. I'm trying to think of the
The
title
Power of
off the top
Habit,
of
I
my head.
believe. There's The
Power of
Power of
Habit,
Habit.
that's what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's very mechanical. And basically at the early stages, when you're really from zero, you're dealing with the friction of starting. And that momentum just feels quite brutal to people to get the wheel started from stop. And so the basic technique is do the smallest thing you can possibly do that is in the direction of what you're trying to get started. So if you're trying to start walking, if you even got up instead of walking to the fridge or staying on the couch and did stretches or walked outside or do anything that's in directionally aligned with what the new habit you're trying to cultivate, even if it feels like that act could do nothing good for you, your whole focus is on starting the habit. How big that motion is doesn't matter as long as you set it into motion. So when people are trying to, for example, work out from home, because that feels intelligent and they're in principle in agreement with it, but they often will talk to me about 30 minutes of that and 40 minutes of this other thing. And I'll say 5 minutes. And they'll say, 5 minutes won't do anything. I say, yes, it will. It'll start your habit. So that might be squats, or that might be a stretch, or that might be a couple sun salutations. It's like the smallest thing you can do, and where it's difficult to make an excuse that you can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to say, I can't get up and stretch. It's hard to say, I can't walk to the corner and back. And so you're just, and sometimes you, like they say, like on that, I forget what that old show was, you call a friend, which I know is challenging right now, but can you enlist help? Can you do anything? And you're really trying to get the wheel in motion. The amount of it doesn't matter. You're really just trying to get over that friction. And then as you go, you increase the intensity or the length or what's involved in it. But not until you've stabilized it as a recurring habit do you put more pressure on that habit to make it bigger. Because when people have not done a habit that's healthy for them for a long time, they set the bar way too high, and then they go gung-ho, and then the habit collapses and they go back to zero. And that's exactly what you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, my friend and I, we have this analogy of imagine hitting a jump on your bike, right? You would love to go and hit a 30-foot jump and get a ton of air, but you need to learn on a 1-foot jump and then maybe graduate to a 2-foot jump and then 3 all the way up to 30 before you can hit the 30-foot jump, or else you're going to break some bones, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
And no
So,
amount of conditioning is going to help you then.
yeah, exactly, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, obviously you understand a lot about these emotional exercises and other people's trauma and the psychology and the science of everything. What kind of daily habits do you implement into your own life to keep yourself thriving?
Well, I would say that, similar to what we were just talking about, and I was thinking, for some reason, I was thinking about that this morning. When did some of these habits form? A number of them form in a not conscious way that we become conscious of. So, fitness, exercise has been my go-to since I was a teenager. I don't think I realized all of why it was important to me when I was 16 or 17.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned that later when I realized when I don't do it, what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these things, and I would say that's one of the big skills when we think about emotional intelligence, it's self-awareness and self-control or self-management. So it's having that conscious awareness of what things do I do that when I do them, it puts me in good shape. And so for me, exercise every day, often more than once a day, at varying intensities and so on. So that's an ever-present. Meditation every day, regulated sleep, and so these are kind of fundamentals for me, are the backbone of mental health strategy, because you're scaffolding on top of that. So if you're rested, if your body's in good shape, if your mind is gathered, all kinds of things are possible that are much more fancy, let's call them, when you have those resources available to you. That when you get up, you're tired, you ache, your body's not energized, your mind is all over the place, and then you try and engage these other strategies. So for me, the fundamental base is getting the mind and the body in a kind of, what's the word, regulated and in alignment, to then do the other things that are going to come up, which might be much more mindset oriented or planning or borrowing future self and all these other kinds of strategies. So that, I would say, is my backbone, is that mind and body state. And then after that, I would say next on that is where relationships fit in. And when we wanted, you said, talking about the science, one of the most predictive variables of all kinds of outcomes, performance, wealth, health, mortality, the strongest predictor of all of those things, relationships, stronger than health habits in predicting outcomes, including mortality. And basically the gist, in a nutshell, because this is not my fundamental area, it's just things I read about, the gist is that we all have these biological predispositions to different illnesses or conditions, and they lay in our kind of DNA inactive as little switches. And what turns on the switches has to do with kind of the chemistry in which those switches live. It's affected by stress, which is most affected by relationships. So for example, when you see how people cope, basically those who are well surrounded socially, who have a variety of support, the supports that they need, first of all, they're less likely for those switches to get switched on in the first place. And secondly, they're the most likely to heal from what does show up. So building and keeping those social relationships in good shape, and different ones will meet different needs, is one of the most fundamental things you can do for your physical and mental emotional health. So I would say I layer that in next after the mind-body alignment.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that I've never thought of it that way, but I'm blown away that it makes so much sense. I mean, it's just kind of how we're wired, right? And in terms of connection and, so.
That we're inherently social beings, and that, when you were talking about what would you do for people who are in the 2 scale, after getting them to trying to help to settle some of those emotions and get some of the basic regulation going, my thoughts are immediately to who's in this person's life who's going to help them. Who are they connecting with? Who's around that they're not connecting with? So if you think about, getting people up to that at least functional level, oftentimes there are people around that they've isolated themselves from because of how they're feeling, and the worse you feel, the less you might want to connect. And kind of making your way back out is reaching out to a lot of these relationships. And if you don't have them, figuring out your strategies to get reconnected, because few or no people do well when they're socially isolated, which is one of the big challenges right now of COVID. Is that, again, depending on what your network is like, where they are, how flexible, how plentiful, how much it needs before, it's got a big tax on it right now because of constraints. So if those constraints have had a major negative impact on your social supports, okay, what is that going to look like now? And you start actively rebuilding that, because you absolutely need that social connection in some form or other, and usually multiple forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to think of it as like you do need it, right? It's not like you can just keep paving the
Not a
way by putting
luxury.
your head down, yeah, and forget about social relationships because you're so focused on business or building something, to the point where once you finally build it or finally sell your business, then you can focus on relationships. It's like, no, you need to focus on that the entire time, right? Like that's gonna help you become successful at whatever you want to do.
Well, and absolutely, in the way when we were talking about fitness before, it's really difficult to build a relationship in the moment of need. It needs to already be there.
Mm.
So and people are often what's the word, discouraged when they're not feeling well around how they've let their relationships fall away. But that's, it's also symptomatic that that's part of how people fall, is that they get disconnected from people, because that those relationships serve so many functions at once. It's support, it's a source of ideas, people challenge your thinking, people are practical support in helping you get concrete things that you need. They might be spiritual inspiration, they might be role models. So imagine cutting yourself off from all of those potential resources. And so it's one of those things that we have to be always mindful of, because if we don't nourish those relationships, they fall away, and then they're not there for us in those moments where we critically need them. So like you say, it is a need. It's not a luxury thing. And so having that forever thought around, I need to keep that top of mind. It might vary, like businesses and like other things. Right now in COVID, we're trying to keep a little bit of connection, even if we can't see people the way we normally would. We're trying not to let our whole network fall away in the meantime, because that's a really important part to people's, not only mental health, but their well-being, their life satisfaction, is who's in their life with them.
Yeah, totally. That kind of leads me to start thinking about a common theme that keeps coming up in my reading in terms of a healthy mindset is contribution, right? And kind of, I think that is very innate in like our social needs, right? In terms of contributing makes us feel good. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about contribution, maybe in your own life and how it makes you feel good,
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting. It even goes beyond. It definitely makes us feel good,
Mm-hmm.
and over and above that, it's one of the 5 pillars when they studied what makes people emotionally well or happy. They boiled it down to 5 factors, and one was kind of that general positive emotion. You can imagine what those positive emotions are: the presence or absence of them. It's engagement. So that might be in work, in projects, in life in various forms, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And so contribution is one that straddles for me between meaning and accomplishment or rewards. So that feeling of, what are the skills that I have? What are the values, attributes? What can I give? What do I have to contribute? And that, leveraging those strengths, leveraging those what your developed or internal characteristics or skills are, has a huge payback for the person who gives it. So it feels good, and it feels meaningful, and it feels aligned, and it also kind of keeps that well full for emotional well-being. So, and I found that for myself, that's shifting as the conditions out there shift. So there's lots of things that I like to do to stay aligned and give what I think are my best skills, but I'm always feeling plugged into what's going on out there to see what does the world need now.
Mm-hmm.
And so when COVID hit, I was noticing, it's kind of the classic. If you're in a plane and it goes into distress, put your mask on first. And so when the health directives were being announced, as like, okay. So my first focus was, because at the time, for example, I was dancing was one of my main physical activities, and I'd be at the studio 3 times a week, and it shut down. So these are big shifts. And where's that activity going to go? Or I'd walk to 30-40 minute walk to work and back every day. Where's that activity going to go? So I quickly kind of put my head down and reorganized myself to say, first, I need to get myself set back up. I got to get everybody online. I got to change my physical activity. And the social was kind of secondary, but to get my own head and body in alignment first. And then I saw how people were reeling, felt very aware of how little people understood why they're reacting the way they're reacting to COVID. And, to come back to the self-determination theory, when you think the 3 drivers are autonomy, competence, and connection, we're taking big hits on all fronts for COVID, but people are reeling without really understanding why. So shifted into psychoeducation, got into free online sessions, Facebook sessions and Zoom sessions, and got into giving them in companies or in clinics and all communities, just to start talking with people about what was going on and why it was going on. Because when people understand, oh, I see what's going on, they can better get to work on doing what they need to do to get their to right the ship. But when you're reeling and you don't know why everything is in turbulence, it's very difficult to get a handhold. So the early days were much more psychoeducational and helping people into the online realm, kind of in quotes, convincing people to try the online thing. So I've been doing even clinical work online for 2-3 years now. But we had some early adopters. Some people are not comfortable. How do we get them to do a single session online to see it's okay? Still going to be helpful if we get them on. So it was a whole lot of bringing people into that. And then after, more recently now, is shifting into, okay, what's now that we've got people basically, adapting, what do we need to do for them now? And so one of those things that came up was around a lot of the social justice questions that were coming up. And I mean, it's a very complex issue to unpack, but a lot of people were going through trauma again, and a lot of people were going through, like, a lot of the upheaval is partly as a result of COVID itself and how people reconnect with their experiences of injustice and then them happening in real time. So how can we, in terms of our understanding of how people react in these situations, how can we guide them? How can we provoke good conversations? How can we be present to those who are experiencing these injustices? How do we help people who might be the authors of those injustices to see their bias and to start to make shifts during difficult times by shifting their mindset? And so there was a period in there, which is a personal interest of mine, is that how can we use things like mindset and awareness of bias to start to respond differently to social justice context?
Yeah, that's a great question. How can you? That's something that I think I'm starting to realize, like, I consider myself very open-minded, and I realize that these are problems, and I realize that I do have privilege, and but when I come down to taking the time to think, like, what can I do, it's tough to come up with those answers. So what would you say one can do?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I find at the front end, when we're talking, we're dealing with individuals, we're working a lot on awareness. And so sometimes it's facilitating a conversation to make people aware of things that they're not aware of, right? Because it's very difficult to make changes on something or in something of yourself that you're not aware needs changing. And so part of that is trying to keep the resistance down and the ideas open. So one of the things I was trying to work with people on is, when people think about they might have contributed to injustice, how do you imagine they feel?
Mm-hmm.
They feel bad.
Yeah.
They feel guilty. They feel shameful. And people defend intensely against feeling any of those things. And so part of the work is trying to have people feeling accountable for themselves, their choices, their language, their actions, their communication style, but keeping the defenses down. So how do you get a lot of information across? How do you, while managing the defense level so the information can go in? And so we'll facilitate conversations and give examples of, things like microaggressions and little small examples of things that cumulatively have a big impact on different forms of diversity or minority, whether it's visible or invisible, to make people aware in a way that we're not activating their defenses. Even discomfort is good, because discomfort breeds change. But if the defenses are too high, there's a kind of total organ rejection. The information just gets shot back out. So some of what we do is try and facilitate those conversations. Now, what I personally do is I read everything that I can read I watch every movie, video to kind of drink in on my own terms when I'm just me with me, because then that keeps the defenses low too. It's all under kind of in quotes under my control. What I'm taking in, I'm not trying to defend myself to anybody. I'm not being challenged in the moment. I'm just reading and absorbing to make myself aware. And then I go out and I have conversations and I discuss to try and integrate that information and kind of deepen that understanding and perspective before I then go facilitate conversations for other people. So I would say mostly it's information consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and to listen to things, that one of the best pieces of advice I got is to listen to people outside our normal channels. So we tend to hang with people who are like-minded. So my social circle feels like a big warm hug for diversity and inclusion. And I like it that way. And that's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
You need to keep your ears open for people who think very differently from you, who have different ideas, to be aware and to learn how to have those conversations with people who don't think like you. And to be open and aware to people challenging you on warm fuzzy ideas that you have about yourself about not being biased that are simply not true, because we all have our biases, and we're trying to bring those into conscious awareness if we're ever going to be more inclusive of people. So there's a lot of really tricky footwork involved in confronting ourselves and our own biases and others. And so finding the right language and finding ways to not attack, to get people taking a more thoughtful, open approach is really tricky work.
Yeah, totally. My line of thinking ended to realize that one simple thing that I can do is, I mean, I grew up in a I guess a household or a culture that, I mean, you would say let's say you say a derogatory term with no intention of it causing harm, but just because it's this unexpected term to be used in that situation, it became humor, right? And I grew up where noticing that using a derogatory term with somebody that I know and trust isn't going to use it as derogatory towards somebody that may be offended by it, but can say it in our circle and get a laugh from it. I started realizing that one simple change I can do is change that. There's way more ways to connect with my friends and my friend group than using derogatory terms, right? So even though they may know I'm not using it maliciously, I'm going to stop that altogether, right? And realize that it's just not something. Because if I look at my value system, I think one of the biggest things I want to do is cause no harm, right? And if someone was to look on that conversation, it could cause harm to somebody. And I think what I've realized is, yeah, just simple conversation with even my closest friends, I can change my behavior in terms of that potential humor with mutual understanding. Just being more careful with it, and I've brought it up to friends and had that conversation with friends, and they totally agree. It's like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, we say these things or these words that we think are funny, but they're not. So yeah,
Humor is such a great example. When we do sessions in groups, often things, so I talk about humor and what kind of gets slid into a joke that's just meant to be a joke. The intent is joke.
yeah,
The outcome or the impact is harm.
yeah,
And so while we had no intent, often people lean on intent as the defense, but you need to look at impact, and you need to decide, is it worth the impact of creating harm for somebody else? And could I do this another way? How big a deal would it be if I made jokes about something else that didn't have that negative impact for somebody, or that potential negative impact? We're not even saying that all people are going to be negatively impacted. We're saying some are. And cumulatively, the messages of those words being out there does more harm for very little good. And so that willingness, when you said, you know what, I don't need to do that, has a huge impact. The things that we've made jokes about years ago, we know now what the impact can be. So people say, oh, that's from so many years ago, we've been doing that. We can stop that now. We can make jokes about something else. And there's that willingness to say, you know what, I'm willing to make a change in myself, because that's what inclusion is. It's like, oh, for me, this was fun and all kinds, but for that other person meant something entirely different, or it could, and I'm willing to let it go in the interest of more people feeling a sense of belonging and inclusion and acceptance and comfort. And so those are fun little language changes, like the number of times that people talk about adult women as girls. I correct them every time.
Mm.
You know, we don't talk about, I met this nice boy at the bank. We don't say things like that, but we'll often say we met this nice girl at the bank. There's no girls working at the bank. There's only women working at the bank. And so when we, model language, or we subtly slide in little corrections about, hey guys, and all these kinds of things, like we're trying to morph the language into something gradually that's more inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a willingness from majority folks to what's the word, to prune away language and habits that could have the potential to create harm for others.
Yeah, totally. I like that term prune away, because it is something that you have to notice is there, and then, yeah, do your
Mm-hmm.
best to prune it away. Yeah, I like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's really profound. I think that I'm going to reflect on this a lot more and see what else I
Mm-hmm.
can prune away, and hopefully listeners
Mm-hmm.
do the
It's
same.
and then, around the lines of meaning, it as much as some taking away some of these habits cost us a little bit because it was fun, or at least we thought it was fun and we enjoyed it, letting it go is also deeply meaningful and rewarding. To see us make a change in ourselves for other people, it has its own rewards, that once we start doing it, we're like, you know what, that doesn't need to be there. I feel much better eliminating that. But we have to kind of experiment with the pruning and clip here and there, and then see what the impact is of doing it. But the feeling that we're contributing to that sense of all people being included is very meaningful to people, like that sense of community. It has, like I say, it has its own reinforcement in there. For experimenting a little, we get to see what that reward is.
Yeah, totally. Wow. That's very eye-opening. Thank you so much. I think it's also the perfect note to end on, unless you have anything else that you would like to speak about.
Well, I have lots I'd always like to speak about, but I think
Yeah.
that's a smorgasbord of ideas for right now. And I think maybe my one last statement would be to say, when we think about the positivity versus, like what people think about, often think of realists as being much more grounded and solid and intelligent. It's just kind of, these are, what's the word, associations, or maybe even stereotypes of, like, when we think about the deep thinkers, we don't think about them as the positive thinkers. We think them as much more skeptical and critical thinkers, and that the positive ones are kind of airheaded and missing things.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're looking to kind of dabble into the more positive, really think about it as, and, you can keep having your critical thoughts, but also turn some of your attention to the positive things. So if at the end of the day, you're going to think about what went wrong, think also about what went right. Try to be more inclusive of what is classically thought of as negative, or failures, or missteps, and also what went well, what were the wins, what were the accomplishments, what were the points of connection, to have a more fulsome view of things. And the tip in that is that our minds already go to what goes wrong. We are disproportionately wired to notice everything that goes wrong, because it's a threat to the system. We are not nearly as well wired for noticing what goes well. So if you disproportionately focus on things, opportunities, things that went well, points of connection, beauty, accomplishment, mostly what you're going to end up with is a balanced picture, because the mind will still notice the other things. What it's failing to notice often is the positive. So if you want to have kind of a grounded perspective, a balanced and even one, you mostly need to layer in a bit more positive and let it live next to what you've noticed already by default, which are some of the things you need to improve or strengthen or repair. In that way, I think you have a pretty good picture, a pretty good balanced and credible picture of yourself, and what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Interesting. So you're not necessarily wrong or anything by thinking critically. It's just the way we're hardwired. And it's going to take all of that practice, like you said, and building emotional strength and all of those things in order to get a more balanced picture.
And so you don't have to turn into sort of like they say called the tiger, like this very happy bouncing off your tail. Like you can land in some form of equilibrium there and already be better off without turning super positive all in one shot, which might be a bit of a leap for some folks.
Yeah, no kidding. Hey,
Yeah.
cool. Well, thanks so much for your time, Francine. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It was lots of fun. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
absolutely. Hopefully we can have you again sometime.
Okay, great.
All right. Cool.
All right.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you go, but thank you so much. That was amazing. I really